Hey there, this is Tim. I'm going to start by going over the brushes we use. On the left we have rosemary ivory rounds, followed by some larger rosemary ivory filberts. Then we have some synthetic eclipse, mostly filberts, and then at the end we have combers, arranged from small to large. The colors used in this still life are going to be lead white on the left, and then we have a chrome primrose yellow, blue ridge ochre, a French sienna, orange malabdate, alizarin crimson, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, a bone black, and then at the very end there we have a Verona green earth. We use that for all the colors in the still life here today. And then with me I brought two of my first year painting students.
Hi, this is Morgan LaPlante.
And Keaton Clark.
And they're going to help me narrate this and hopefully ask some insightful questions for those watching at home. I'm beginning this painting with a toning for the background. I'm going very, very thin. I've actually decided already that this is going to be an Abosh approach, a colored block-in, beginning very thin and then moving thicker and thicker as we go. Somewhat similar to the color master copy from first term, just developed to a little bit more of a completed painting here. And starting much, much thinner. This thin Abosh start was very popular in the late 1800s, used by a lot of Impressionists also. It allows you to lock in onto color families and basic value structures while achieving your shapes. So it's a pretty advanced block-in. It allows you also to consider the possibility of thin transparent paints and washes, foiled against more opaque paints, which is a little bit different than what we looked at with the color master copy, where we went in with a color block-in of more pure paint, which was done with the intent to slowly build up the layers of thickness over a series of sessions and scrape it down to achieve a lot of smooth finish there. So we're going to have a little bit more texture in this painting overall. And it's going to be foiled by areas which are much thinner to create the suggestion of some texture. I've created a toning to match that backdrop that I have. I've just laid up some linen behind the still life that's actually supposed to reflect something like a wall, maybe a stuccoed wall with some light cracking in it. So I've toned the canvas to try and match that as much as I can. And now I'm going in and starting to figure out some of the basic drawing of the painting. You can see I'm taking a lot of levels. I'm locking into a site size spot and then taking levels, but I'm not just having it arbitrarily decided. I know about where I want the top of this brass pot to be. I know where I want the bottom diagonal of the rug to be. And so with that I'm trying to figure out where I want the back line where the rug meets the wall. And I've pretty much settled on it. I've actually thought about this composition before I started. I've used some of the harmonic proportions in it, the divisions of quarters, thirds, and halves, and think about where the major diagonals of the design should be. And now I'm jumping right in and laying in some strong values here. Even though I'm painting thinly, I can still get nice deep values. I just have to make sure I'm using dark colors for to achieve this. It's a bit different than what we see with some of the limited palette paintings here. This is more of a traditional palette that we might have. I haven't really organized it too much by value, other than it's kind of left light on the left, dark on the right, and then I just have yellow, red, and blue. So this is much more how we would see the majority of artists arrange their palette. I just have to remember that if I want to lighten things, I go, at least at this stage, with lighter paint or, more appropriately, even thinner. And then if I want to go darker, I just use less thinner and the darker paints. I'm just trying to, using my large bristle brush here, just really roughly block in a bunch of color with value changes. Really not soften anything out. I want all of this to potentially appear as texture as the painting gets developed, and sort of give me a sense for the directional marks that I want things to take to kind of reflect the rug and the various things that are on the still life there. And just lock into the overall color. I want it to appear the overall color when I step back from a distance. So I got a little too red in there, had to go in with a little more yellow. This can be one of the most fun parts of the paint because you're going so loose, but you do have to make sure that in all of this looseness you know where you have to slow down and get a little more accurate. So for example, right now where I'm handling some of the more particular placements of the pot back there, I'm going a little slower to ensure that the ellipse is correct, that everything is lined up where I need it to be lined up, and then I get a little more sort of loose and devil-may-care when I start to actually fill in those shapes and just kind of suggest color with just looking at my subject with a glance, sort of a fleeting eye to kind of capture the overall color essence and value essence of what's up there without getting too precise. One thing you can note too is that I'm actually able to make more marks than just one or two strokes here as opposed to when we start to lay down more opaque paint, because I'm really scrubbing some paint in here. I'm really getting some firm brush work where I'm pushing paint to the side and replacing it with new paint as opposed to letting it sit on top or mush together. So the colors stay a little bit cleaner this way, and also it allows me to just kind of work all around and sort of intuitively place some color. And because it's so thinly painted, if there's errors here, they're easily corrected later on. I think the challenge and difficulty associated with the starting method like this, as opposed to how, for example, we may have started the drawing year, is that I won't have the ability as much here to have firm anchors of shapes. You know, with the drawing year, we really start with as much accuracy as possible, so that anytime something's a little off, we're able to detect it. Here I'm laying in with this idea that in general it's correct, but there's a lot of smaller inaccuracies, and so you have to figure out which is the correct information to keep and which is the stuff that has to be adjusted for the sake of correctness. And I think that is one of the most challenging skills for a student to learn and pick up on. They end up noodling things that are just really not important to the overall correctness. And if that's something that's too hard for you to do, at least with the drawing, it's advisable to start with the drawing first and then transfer that drawing over to the canvas so you have a really strong understanding of where all these sort of abstract color shapes need to go.
So do you mean noodling in this stage when you don't need to be noodling?
Well, no, even in later stages too. You know, when this blocking's all done and then it's time to do some more opaque paint on top, they don't know which, students don't really know which things have to be corrected, and so they just might pick anything that might seem easy and just, paint and paint and paint and not really need to do much correction.
Oh, okay.
Here I'm going in actually with a clean brush, relatively clean brush, and I just carved out the shape of that first little plate there. Those nice antique, wobbly, dented plates. In setting up the still life, I really tried to think about things we've talked about in the composition course. For those of you at home, we don't have that lecture series filmed, but you can certainly look at all the recommended reading lists and go through those and pick up on all that information. But I'm really considering this idea that the still life is about one thing, one idea, and everything I've selected, all these objects, are there to help reinforce that idea. So the textures of things, I want this to look a little more antique or old or like used. So my plates aren't necessarily perfect plates. Their perspectives are a little off because they've been so hammered and banged up, which we actually did a little bit of that because they were a little too perfect earlier, so we actually had a hammer and I was smashing them a bit. We have that old brass oven back there. Everything on here is supposed to tie into each other, not just in content theme, like this idea of sort of Middle Eastern objects with the dates and the incense chips, but also with the colors, the idea of selecting a rug that picks up the colors of the brass and repeats the color there. The idea that in the design stage, how there's reinforcing angles that repeat each other. Everything in the still life hopefully looks like it should belong together. Nothing really looks out of place. No one's really trying to struggle to understand why there's certain things in the still life. You just kind of accept it like, oh yeah, that's supposed to be there. And that's a successful still life idea. It allows people to access the idea more immediately and not spend their time questioning why things are in there. They can spend their time enjoying the painting a little more. I'm using a little balled up piece of, or rolled up piece of paper towel here, dipped in some turp, and you can see I can go in and dig right back down to the canvas to get all of these lighter lights and highlights. I am going to potentially need to use some transparency and washes or thin paint to achieve some of these higher value, higher chroma things. And so, and especially in the beginning when I'm trying to do this as a thin abash, I don't want to add white paint to my painting early on. So make sure you get in there with some thinner to strip out those lights. It also will give you a lot of hard edges really early on and help you set your edge structure for the painting, which is something you can think about in the very beginning. And now we're going in to lay in some strong paint, going in more for treating this almost as though it's an alla prima painting, where I want to paint this as much as I can in one session and get it to a point where I could probably actually just leave it and say, hey, yeah, I like that as a painting, before carrying on or leaving for the day. That sort of dovetails into this idea that it shouldn't take you more time to paint something correct. It should just give you a different finish if you spend more time. And that should be the overriding rule with anything that you do. Accuracy is not necessarily supposed to be something that takes a long time to get. If that's the case, it means you should probably be doing some of the more basic exercises and drills to beef up your skill level. Because if accuracy takes you a long time, especially in a still life like this where nothing's moving, it just means that you're making so many mistakes that you're having to go back and correct them too much. And so that just lets you know that it's time to maybe slow down, re-examine the drawing videos, make sure your drawing skills are up to par to be able to paint before wasting hours and hours and hours on a still life like this. I'm working with the ivory filbert here. It comes to a bit of a point so I can get some more detailed work, but it's also relatively stiff, so I can lay in more solid paint if I want, and I can also strip paint away really easily. And actually that's what you can see me doing in a lot of the column here of the oven. I'm kind of digging in there and exposing a little bit of the canvas underneath, making this sienna and molybdate orange a little more transparent and rich and luminescent, and giving me also this pattern of kind of this worn, battered brass here. I'm digging in there with a brush with some thinner to adjust my shape while keeping my edge nice and hard. This is a better option early on in the painting before you have too much built up, because it's going to keep my edges really clean and keep my colors really clean. Correcting the drawing by removing paint. This is sort of a key concept that will keep your paintings with stronger edge quality and stronger colors and values. Whereas if we add paint, if we were to add paint to the background, instead of at this early stage stripping away with thinner, then we're going to get some paint buildup, and we're going to get that background color to potentially mix with the foreground color a little bit, or the pot, and start to get a little bit less clean colors and start to get edges that are just a little out of focus or mushy, where right now I want these edges to be particularly crisp. So I'm correcting the perspective right now just by removing paint. back in with a small brush here. I even, if you just saw, removed a little bit of paint to get a highlight on the rim of the column there with the back of the brush, just scraping into it. And then I went in with my bristle brush and a little thinner to pull out a bigger highlight in there. And this is something that I may decide to keep thin and just have that be my highlight. Or perhaps later on, the paint might set up enough and get stiff enough where I can go in and paint a more thick, solid stroke on top of it to get that highlight. I'm not using any medium here except a little bit of thinner for this early stage. And then after this first pass, if I go on top, it'll be with some oils, just some linseed oil or possibly linseed with a little sand oil. But this stage is still, it's sort of just, I guess, almost like an advanced gouache, if I would have to give it a name, because I'm still working relatively thin with a lot of transparent layers. It's almost like a watercolor, except the fact that I'm getting a little bit more opaque in a few areas. But I'm really trying to utilize as much thinness as I can to describe the form. And by thinness, I don't mean trying to stretch out a small amount of paint over a large period. It's really a more advanced technique that's going to require you to understand your materials. In this case, a linen panel, how it behaves, just how much thinner to put in, so that my paint doesn't mush together and soup together, which kind of what happens with a lot of beginner painters. Also making sure at this stage really that I'm not licking the canvas. Licking will destroy all of that little subtle variation that I have, and I need to keep all that subtle variation at this stage, otherwise I'm going to have to go on thicker in multiple layers to achieve the same effect. It becomes largely about an economy thing. Unless there's a specific reason for you to want to paint many, many, many layers, you should paint it as directly as you can. Achieve the texture immediately if you can. So notice for this whole painting so far, I still have not used any white paint. And that's what you're going to see for quite a while. Just using the paints at their local value and adjusting them with a little bit of thinner if I need to. But I have a pretty nice tone in that background, which means I'm able to judge the values of the area that I'm painting pretty well against that background right away.
Are you going to sort of work your way down the still life? Is that what you plan to do?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Kind of like a window shading technique, starting at the top and just working my way down. And hopefully get as close as I can while I do it.
Okay.
And it's a little different, too, than if this were kind of a Schmid still life where I would start with what I want to be my center of interest and then build out from there. I don't really have a strong center of interest for this painting. I think for me the most interesting thing is this pot, so maybe that is the center of interest, but I'm not really necessarily putting too much more development into this pot than into other areas. Actually, I think if we played this back, the most time was spent probably on the dates in the cup on the right. To understand those and seek out those. But this is definitely more of a naturalistic kind of painting where I'm just trying to see the overall set of edges and values and colors. And so instead of sort of the Schmid way of starting with one area and really painting it out and then painting everything a little less, which is one way to focus and guide a painting, I'm just kind of starting at the top and working my way down and trying to capture things as closely and honestly as I can. Trying to take some levels to figure out the perspectives of this pot here. I think my actual shape of the pot is probably a little bit different ultimately as this ends than the reference down there. But it's close enough to be believable to that pot. And so that's going to be good enough for at least a still life like this, unless there's some real reason to really stress out of every single precision, which I've had some students do. I've tried to train them to be so attentive to precise measurement that they'll spend, an hour and a half trying to map out some of the variation or specificity when they were already close enough in the first 15 minutes, and so all that extra time didn't really add to the painting at all. So now I have started to dip into some of the white to get some of these more neutral, cooler reflections that we're seeing on here. I am painting this under a white light, which we'll see for a lot of the videos throughout this series as we move away from the master copies. And of course, if we recall from the cool warm lecture, if we have a white light which has no inherent temperature to it, then the shadows aren't going to be affected by a relative color temperature look. So we're not going to have a cool light warm shadow situation here. We're not going to have a warm light cool shadow situation here. It's more of a local color situation here and a reflected light situation. So whatever light is hitting the rugs and various things around the pot and bouncing back in, that's what's giving it its color. I am seeing slightly cooler lights in some of the more glare or reflection area of the pot, simply because probably because it's bouncing off that white wall behind it, so it's just making it kind of a creamy, velvety neutral. It's not really much of it. It's almost impossible to describe that color, I don't know, without using the word gray, which is a color that I've instructed my students not to use, a word that you don't want to use. It's not a color, it's a description of a color. And so for each of those little pieces, I'm really trying to just zero in and try to see a color and understand the chroma of that color and then lay it down. And that's why you're going to see a painting like this with this sort of color and light structure setup is going to be much more challenging to execute than one with a clear color temperature for its light source, either warm or cool. It's going to force you to observe more, which, I think as a student, I think that's a great thing, force you to actually observe. It removes that shortcut of getting something to look glowy or luminescent or correct just by using a color temperature trick. Note how I can stay a little more obscure, a little less specific by keeping back on the handle of my brush. Whenever you start to choke that brush, you start to noodle too much. It forces you to get close to your painting, and then you start to zero in on too much detail instead of rather the tiny little abstracts or random variations that create the larger idea. So by stepping back and using the back of my brush, I can kind of just jab an area or noodle an area a little bit with kind of about the right color, right about value, and see if that affects it enough to make it a little more correct. I'm going to start laying in some really nice rich darks for the bottom here. Just keep in mind that the camera throughout this video is going to have a really difficult time being able to capture the color in the lights while at the same time capturing the color in the darks. It's usually a one or the other shot. So it's probably going to appear for the majority of the video a little bit darker in the shadow side than it actually is. So keep that in mind when you're working at home. I think the still shot we have of probably both the painting but also of the reference will show you a little bit more of the color in the shadows, but even then it's reduced a little bit more. Um, but you can get pretty close. Just remember that you don't want to simplify it or average it out to be just a flat black or flat dark. Notice as I start with that bone black base, I'm also adding in that orange molybdate in there to really warm it up and give it some color. And this is something I've talked about before in color class that sometimes blows people's minds, this idea that you can start with black as your color and then add some color to it and modify it, and gives you just these wonderfully rich, glorious, dark colors that you wouldn't get any other way. And you know, I came, I think, from a school of thought, as most other students did, where black is not something that you should really be using. You should always mix your own black and whatnot. But really, that rule applies to if you need a literal black, whereas almost nothing ever that you paint should be a literal black. And so then black becomes a tool for creating very dark, rich colors. You know, it's such a low chroma color that you can influence it really easily. So as opposed to starting with an alizarin and you know, maybe a viridian, which will give you sort of a deep dark purple, which has a kind of a strong color influence, or even just dark colors that are kind of generalized, I don't know, just generally too colorful in like ultramarine blue also. You know, you get such strong color influences with those that you end up sacrificing the color family in an attempt to get the value. Whereas if we start with something like a black, it's just like clay. You know, we can mold it to be almost any color that we want really, really easily, and achieve our deep, rich values that way. So if you're going to want to do chiaroscuro style paintings, especially, you know, with really deep, rich darks, you should definitely get some black on your palette.
And what did you say? That's a bone black? How is that different than ivory black?
It just uses a different pigment. I think overall it's a little less blue, so it's even a little more neutral, which I think is a good reason to start with that as a base for dark colors. If I were using a limited palette, I definitely wouldn't use the bone black as my blue.
Okay.
And did you choose bone black because of the lighting conditions?
You know what? I think I chose bone black because when I bought these colors from Rublev, they didn't have an ivory or anything like an ivory. So bone black kind of seemed like a nice substitute. It was just a lower chroma, so I said, hey, sure, let's go for it. And I ended up really liking it when painting with it because of its relative neutrality to a lot of the ivory blacks that I've used. And so then really the only blue on my palette is that ultramarine blue, which is a very different idea than we've looked at previously with, you know, the red, yellow, and blue in 5 different values, and sort of thinking like a printer that way. That really puts value at the forefront of your thought. Whereas, you know, this system of color mixing, this more traditional one, presupposes you already have strong value, knowledge, and understanding and usage in your drawings to be able to arrange your palette sort of just as a general light to dark and be able to keep all of your values in check, which I think is a poor supposition of most people starting to paint. Most people do not have that good of value handling and observation, and I think that's in fact probably one of the weakest things I see in people just starting out painting. Not as weak as Edges, but it's right up there. So I have a specific brush just for my darks here that I'm using, and you can see just like other paintings I've done before and what you'll see later on, I've clearly segregated my mixing surface to have lights on the left and darks on the right. I don't want those colors to get muddy, especially this early in the game when I started to dip into some of my white. Now I have to pay extra special attention to not intertwine these two, whereas when I knocked in that Abosh, everything could just be one giant puddle, and I can modify it as I wanted to. But now I'm starting to use white. White can be a dangerous color, so I've got to be a little more careful. Notice I went in there again with the terp to carve out the bottom of that pot as opposed to the white this early on. I'll only want to use white in my light colors if it's to advance the structure or form or the painting of something, whereas if it's a drawing correction, just a basic sort of abstract shape correction, I try to go thinly, use just a clean brush and dig into the paint, or a clean brush with some terp to dig into the paint. That way I don't get too much white paint in there too soon. That was a nice stroke. This painting, we'll see, I think is comes out to be 12 to 15 hours. It's what would be a 5-session painting in class. But it is going to be a little bit more of a studied painting where I'm going to try and advance it and advance it, advance it as much as I can in the amount of time I have. And so it's a little different than if you were doing a really direct painting, which you could also spend 5 days on. And if you're going to do that approach, if you're looking at people like Richard Schmid, kind of for your sort of master artist that you're following, you could still spend 5 days on a still life like this. You would just do it one piece at a time. So you'd just start at one area, really develop it out, give yourself a day or two on that area, refine it as much as you can, and then go to the next area and key that to the first area. So instead of kind of bouncing all over like I'm doing, you'd get a little more focus right in the beginning and build up some finishes right away, as opposed to this overall block in that I'm laying down here. And the nice thing, though, with something like this, like a more studied painting, even if your intent is to be more of a direct painter, is that I'm going to gain a very deep understanding of value and color, and also importantly the textures that I'm dealing with and how to achieve these textures. Like we're going to see how I have to achieve the blue in a very specific way later on. So that understanding can then be applied towards a direct painting. So I could spend even a month on this painting and really paint it out and get every little nook and cranny and really understand it, and then use that knowledge to execute an alla prima. And because of all the studying I've done on this painting, all the knowledge I've gained, the alla prima can be done more boldly, more directly, more confidently, and more accurately right from the very start. And so you can have a really fantastic alla prima painting, even though you spent a month studying how to do it on something like this. And this is not unlike a lot of the other direct painters of the past, like Sargent, doing so many studies and so many preparatory works so that the final, in some cases, could be executed very, very quickly. And it just gives your alla prima more strength and less of the noodly quality to it. So that is something to consider. Even if your intent is really loose paintings, slowing down to understand all of this can really help you with your final. And there's been some cases where I have done just that. Really long studied painting of something like a still life or a portrait to really flesh it out, and then I do a really fast alla prima, and the alla prima is usually the one that people like the most and want to buy, because people tend to like that strong bravura tendency in brushwork and in the painting. And so, there's nothing wrong with that. The alla prima took me just as long to paint as the more studied painting, because I had to do the studied painting to be able to do the alla prima. It's just I ended up with 2 paintings out of it instead of 1, and my alla prima doesn't get overworked. Starting to lay in these dates now. I am still squinting a little bit and letting my eyes go out of focus quite a bit to try and just capture the overall color essence of things. And because I'm not licking the canvas, because I'm just sort of boldly stating all of these thicker paint strokes here that'll actually get knocked down a little later, I'm developing also a relatively good set of edges here, so nothing's getting too frothy or out of focus. I have noticed that some students who do block-ins like this, where they're just going in with pure paint, end up licking or softening the canvas out so much that the distinction between shapes becomes less clear, which then just wastes your time here. And also some of their colors get a little mushed up, and potentially their values also. So, all these statements that I'm making are bold, confident statements. I'm just remembering that if they're wrong, I'll get to fix them later. I'm not going to try and noodle them now, if that makes sense. I'll also be able to make a better judgment about what is wrong versus what needs to be corrected after everything is more laid in. As opposed to, now dealing with things in isolation. I can do it because of my years of experience, but I've noticed most students can't. They don't see that they're working on an area that looks totally fine and they should move on, but because they don't have all these other areas around it, it looks out of context, and so they destroy the area that was good. And that doesn't mean you should just go really quick and throw color all over, mind you. You should still be going slow and steady and confidently. It's just you don't want to noodle areas.
Okay.
It's a fine line to walk, really. I would recommend for my students and for those of you working at home to execute at very minimum a portrait study of this before starting to understand the value structure before you lay in this first pass like this. And also a color sketch would be good too. Just something you spend 20 or 30 minutes on to understand the overall colors of an area. So I'm going to lay in the first pigment puddle here, which is the sienna. So I actually have burnt sienna powdered pigment there. I am using a lot of my French sienna to paint it, but I'm having to beef up the chroma with some orange, molybdate orange, and a little alizarin in there. I'll definitely opt for a little more chroma earlier on if I can, rather than less chroma, especially if, as we'll see with some of these other pigments, I'm having to deal with a little more transparency if I'm intending to get more opaque on top. Use those dates in the background to more specifically carve out the shape of the plate. It's interesting to look at my palette. You'll see it kind of morph overall. There'll be kind of reddish oranges in one area, and then yellow golds in another, and then sort of bluish grays in another. It just sort of takes on its overall families, and that helps me to really fine-tune on the tiny little variations that are happening in each part that I'm painting. Trying to scrub in some texture and carve out that back cup a little more. Doing lots of measuring. This is the time to really try and catch as much of the drawing errors as you can. I did some measuring during the initial abache when I kind of blocked things in, but now that I'm doing my first pass, I really want to make sure I've measured things a little bit more to make sure they're a little bit closer. I don't want to end up building up, 3 or 4 layers of paint on here and then realizing that a shape is wrong. Hopefully it's just minor fine-tuning each time I do a pass here. So I get the relative proportions correct, and then each time I add a little more color, I can chop down and fine-tune the drawing a little bit more. It's kind of like how when we looked at the drawing here, we started with a box, which is the basic proportion, and then we do a pass where we break it all down, and then we do another pass where we break it down a little more, another pass where we break. So in the very end, after you've done several passes around a shape, you have something that's really refined and really descriptive. It's been accurate the whole way through, it's just a little more refined each time. And that should be the sort of mentality you take when approaching painting like this. We're starting in with a quote-unquote block in, but just because it's a block in does not mean it's haphazardly measured or inaccurate. It just means that it's more simple, like the earlier stages of our drawing. And then with each pass of color, we take that block in more and more refinement. It doesn't mean that it necessarily even gets more and more correct. It just gets more and more true to what's up there, more and more refined.
Do you take breaks when you're working on a still life like this?
Oh yeah, I still take breaks every 20 minutes or so. It's just you don't really see them in the video. We kind of filtered them out, and we are sped up something like 3 or 4 times. Maybe it's 3 times for this video. So I'm working pretty quickly, and luckily all the breaks are chopped out of here, and it's pretty fluid in this. There's not too much camera shifting here. Remember, we do have the video clips that you can go back and watch that are real-time speed. If you want to see this in real time, which I think, again, came out to be something like 12-ish hours. And then you can see really the speed with which I am actually laying things out and how long I'm actually spending mixing. Something we've seen in some of the other videos and talked about, how there's a lot more time happening on the palette generally than on the canvas. So you can get a real taste for that. And we did not go through and filter out the measuring, especially in the later demonstrations that we'll see, like with the extended figure painting. There's a lot more measuring even that's happening than this. And so if we hadn't sped it up, then it would seem like there's just such a long dramatic pause between each of these strokes. And that's what you'll see if you see the real-time video. But you can at least, when you see a particular area of interest, you can slow down. You can see the brush I'm using a little better. It's almost difficult to see what type of brush I'm using here, which I think right now is just the synthetic evergreen filbert here, laying some paint down. But you can see a little more precisely everything that I'm doing. The thickness of the paint, how I'm cutting things in or laying things on top of. Getting really thick here with this yellow. And even though the paint that I'm laying out is, the pigment puddle pile that I'm painting is a yellow ochre, my yellow ochre, my Blue Ridge ochre alone is not enough to achieve this actual effect. So I'm still having to be very observant to the color shifts that are happening up there, and there are subtle color shifts. So I'm dipping into that chrome primrose yellow to lighten it up and keep it yellow at a lighter value. I even dipped in a little bit to some of my reds to deepen it around the outsides where it picks up a little more of the reflected light of the pots. That's all going to be required to help it appear natural and have some variation. If you just paint it as just yellow ochre there, it will definitely appear flat, like a cutout construction paper shape. You can see the room that we're in, all around the painting and palette is a very, very dark room. This was actually designed to be our cast and still life room where all of the light is very, very controlled. So in this painting, more so than any other painting that we'll look at, I think, I have the same exact light on my canvas that I do on the still life. So there's all the walls are painted a flat black. There's just one light overhead, so we have really dramatic shadows on the cast, and very, very similar lighting between the cast and the reference. If you're doing this at home, having a room like this is certainly helpful to understanding shadow clarity, but also you can build a shadow box yourself. Just with a cardboard box, and you paint the inside of the walls of the cardboard box black, and then you cut a hole in it to shine a light through. You get a nice, deep, rich shadow box. I tried to paint in my ultramarine blue puddle here. You can see with ultramarine blue and some white that definitely did not work. It immediately killed the color and the glow. So I'm laying back in here more transparently. I wiped it off and I'm trying to just go transparent with my ultramarine blue to achieve the same color quality of the reference. So I'm getting a little bit closer here now. And then just using some a little more pure ultramarine blue around the outside to get some deeper darks. Now I'm picking up my comber. I probably actually just took a break right there, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to paint this. I switched actually over to my evergreen filbert here instead of the comber, deciding to paint this a little thicker with the initial lay-in and get a little deeper with the paint. It's actually hard to use the combers this early on. Even though they're great for texture, it would require me to thin out the paint so much. Whereas the intent of this painting is to actually build up multiple paint layers thicker and thicker and thicker. So the combers in this case will mostly just be used for softening edges as opposed to laying down a lot of paint. And that's important, getting the right brush for the right job here. Using some of that Verona green earth really gets some nice variations of greens and golds in that rug there in the shadow. I'm dipping into my oil a little bit here, so that's my medium. It's to the left of my terp. You can see my terp canister there, and my little jar of oil is just to the left of it. So, especially in these dark areas where I want them to stay a little richer, I am dipping into a little bit more oil to get the paint a little more fluid, retain a little bit more of that sheen. Even though I'm painting this rug, I consider it relatively low priority in the overall accuracy of the still life compared to that big brass pot in the background. So every once in a while, I'll paint some of the foreground, and then I'll go back and just re-examine my drawings. That's why you see me keep going back in and trying to refine that pot a little bit more. I do have my comber in here. I need to definitely get some texture in this rug as I lay it down. It's an older comber, so it's a little stiffer, which makes it a little bit more suitable for paint load rather than a brand new comber, which would definitely not be able to sort of push and scrape the paint around the same way at this level of thickness here. Finding that green. A lot of transparency happening in there. Notice not a lot of opaque paint. Even though I'm mixing it a little more opaquely, I'm really cutting into it with the brush. And all of that variation with the transparency and opacity is actually beginning to set sort of the key for all this texture that's happening inside the rug. Also gives a very painterly quality to it. There's this idea here, it's very similar to the Bosch, where I can handle transitions between colors really thinly just by kind of scraping between them. Almost like when we looked at drawing on toned paper between the white chalk and the charcoal, you would just erase out and lift out, and it facilitates a transition without actually mixing the two. You can do the same sort of thing with brush and with color. You kind of scrape into it, create that transition where you don't just have mud at the intersection of those two, you have a sort of a broken color interaction where the edge quality is softened a little bit, but it's not just muddy, chalky look. And again, that happens with thin paint. If you're using paint that has been stretched or thinned a little bit and is not super thick or opaque. If you're using opaque paint, they will just kind of mush together. I can also get some of these harder edges with thin paint that are going to be quite a bit more difficult to get with thicker paint. I would definitely have to let this dry to be able to get some of the harder edges in the rug. Whereas if it's thin, again, you can use the side of your brush and cut right in. So overall, this blocking kind of looks like a chaotic mess. It's kind of like an alla prima, but certainly not as carefully measured. I don't have quite as much buildup in some areas that I would if this were going to be an alla prima. But the overall idea of the color impression and the value impression is all pretty much there, which is what I want for nice solid blocking. Some of those greens in the rug. Just my ultramarine blue and some of my yellows in there. They're nice, neutral, soft green. You know, a lot of these Rublev paints, they don't have as much of the chromatic punch as some of the newer ones. You know, they use more historical pigments and no fillers, and um, as a result, some of their colors, as you mix them, they tend to get a little more neutral, which is actually really nice if you're looking for a more subtle painting. You know, it might be a little harder to take it outside and do a really intensely colored landscape painting, but it's really suited for something like this. We're going with this soft white light on here. So to get some of those greens, you know, it's actually not that hard as long as everything else is neutral enough, but it does require that you think a little bit more about the transparency and opacity. You know, it's something that I had to consider with the blue. You know, I didn't have anything strong enough to hit that blue opaquely, so I really had to go transparent. So it's going to force you to think a little bit more about your application of paint and how you're manipulating the paint to get the color effects that you want. That background a little bit darker, a little bit more textured. This lead primed surface that I'm using is really great. It sets up and dries the paint nice and quickly, so you can paint more immediately on top of it. Also has a little bit more tooth, just by its the quality of it, to grab the paint a little bit more. So I can lay things on really thick. I can also go on pretty thin, and those layers that I do put on thin set up fast enough for me to layer more quickly. I gotta get that background kind of out of focus. The thing about edges at this stage is important as anything else, I think. You know, setting up this idea of how the painting is going to be developed in terms of what's soft, what's lost, what's hard. Um, it allows you to then not sacrifice later on your color quality and your values to try and get edges because you didn't think about them early enough. I'm back in here with a bigger brush, and this is something interesting to note. Um, you know, I'll go smaller brush for a while, and then I'll go back to the bigger brush for a while, smaller brush for a while, bigger brush for a while. It's this idea of micro to macro. Thinking about small details and how all the little inner relationships work, and then going back and making sure your big general impression is correct. And that big brush will force you to sometimes obliterate details that you may have liked if it's for the greater good of the painting and the relationships that you need to have. And back to a smaller brush. This idea that it's almost the alla prima mentality here, where I need to get this blocking done today, kind of idea, will also help refocus all of my efforts to ensure that I'm not noodling or committing too much time to developing detail in an area when I need to be focusing on the overall bigger picture. This is where all that accuracy is established right here. And it may end up forcing some paint application that creates textures that I wouldn't have otherwise conceived. Kind of some dry brush sort of scrubbing to soften that cast shadow into the back wall. I think very much right now it's still kind of an impressionistic abstract painting. I'm not thinking about things in terms of their form, just in terms of what are the little pieces of light and dark and color that are there, trying to capture those without really trying to model anything or be too descriptive. I'm not concerned right now with people really understanding that it's a rug that they're sitting on. These are pigment puddles, or that there's dates in the cup or anything. It's just what are the collection of shapes on here to get something that looks kind of like what's up there.
Will you shift focus after that's figured out?
Yeah. After that block in, and after I start to sink into my later levels of the painting, I really have to make sure that there's clarity in here, because that's just what this type of painting is. If this were intended to be a more direct, loose, kind of alla prima painting, where that abstraction is favored, I would keep it more abstract. But I would also make sure, give a little more thought to when I step back, even though this is abstract, does this still look like what it's supposed to look like? Because that's a harder thing, I think, to actually pull off, is keeping something really abstract and loose, but also having it understandable enough for the viewer to not question it or get confused. And I think that's where the real demand and amazing quality about a looser alla prima painting comes in, is that something can be so loose and so direct and look so abstract up close, but really be understandable and quite clear from a distance. And with this type of painting, you don't really have that struggle as much. That's not a challenge I have to impose on myself, because just like with anything else, I can break it up in steps. You can do this stage here where you're just getting the overall relationship of shape, color, edge, and value, and then not really caring if it doesn't make sense yet. You're just laying down the basic scheme for each of those things, and then you build it up on top. And you get it more and more refined with that idea of clarity at the forefront of your mind. And so, not really caring whether or not it's abstract later on. It's much easier, I think, to paint this way um, than to have to balance the abstraction, which could also imply, a lot of broken colors that need to come together to average out, and a lot of edges that you're not actually seeing, but you're kind of suggesting to create an optical effect. There's a lot of other complexities involved with that alla prima and abstraction that you don't necessarily have to deal with here. But that's why you look at paintings that are more like this, or more of a classic way of building it up, even with the drawing underneath, and then the open grisaille, and the closed grisaille, and then the color laid on top. Those more simple, straightforward, understandable ways of painting have produced all those really successful examples we see in museums. It's lots of people have been able to do it for centuries and centuries. Because it's more understandable and more clear. This whole alla prima, direct abstract kind of thing. It's a newer idea and a newer thought process, and it's sort of implies that you already know how to do, or understand at least, a lot of this other stuff that we're doing here in this video. But that's why again, going back to that whole idea of doing a more studied, detailed painting like this can help you execute an alla prima more correctly, because at least you have a guideline to the more rendering like this, and you can figure out how to abstract it later on if needed.
So are you softening everything here?
Yes, yeah, I'm using my comber here, and I'm going through and knocking down edges, helping the sides of the pot recede back towards the wall, allowing some of the edges in the fronts to be a little crisper. Again, that background is really set up quite nicely already because of that lead primed ground, and because I was using a little bit of thinner to paint some of this, so I can really get in there and be a little more abrasive with my comber. There was just too much paint in there. It's starting to get a little too muddy. I'm just lifting it off a bit. When trying to get these really intense bright colors, it's always easier to start lighter, and thus you can get a little more brighter color, and then go darker later, rather than laying it in darker and trying to go lighter on top of it. Because of the way oil paint dries a little darker and more opaque as it ages, it's better to start with something lighter if your intent is to maintain that super high chroma. I need to figure out a way to handle that transition from the rug into the background. I don't necessarily want to paint it exactly as it is in the reference. You can see you can see a little bit of the dark background underneath on the left, and on the right it's kind of obscure. So I am softening edges out a little bit more, which is a little bit more of an optical effect, as if I had taken the reference photo with a different depth of field, it would produce some of these edges, and that's actually achieved if I'm standing closer, around where my canvas is, and looking at the reference. I cannot see the background in the same way that you can see it in the reference here. Those side edges to the side and to the back, they really get blurred out because my eyes aren't able to focus on those sides simultaneously while focusing at the center where the majority of the objects are. And so, so I'm actually softening those background edges compared to how I am seeing them from up close. You know, if you're utilizing photo reference for painting like this, you can actually get that yourself just by, again, adjusting that depth of field. You get a really small f-stop, so something like a 1.6 or a 2.0 f-stop, and really get close to your subject, and then focus on your subject. All those surrounding edges will start to get melted away and kind of vignetted. So we're just advancing the color a little bit more, trying to fine-tune all of this color before we start to zero in on anything a little bit more specific. Um, and then we'll build up an area to really have the qualities a little more that we want in the final painting here. And I'll have to stay kind of on track to hit my 5-day timeline. I don't know that I'll necessarily get more than one or maybe 2 passes over an area without running out of time. So I have to really ensure that I'm staying focused. Luckily, my palette is large enough that I'm able to pretty much keep the groups of color on there, um, and just dip back into it as needed, as long as I remember what I was using to paint in each section. That's kind of the key. And I don't want to contaminate these colors with any colors that are a little too different. So I see that happen quite a bit too. It's one of the reasons why some people struggle with their colors, is they may have an ice puddle like this, but then, you know, if the color family is too drastically different or the color value is too drastically different, instead of starting a new puddle, they just dip right into these and try to modify it, and then that's when it sort of ruins the color quality of an area. But this palette, you know, it's pretty convenient. It's vertical, so I can really see what the colors are going to look like before I lay it down. And I've always painted like that ever since I first started, and I found that to be tremendously helpful and less frustrating. You know, there's not as much struggle trying to unite what I'm mixing with what I'm actually laying down. But also, it's just made with a cheap frame. I think I picked it up from a dollar store. It's an 11 by 14 frame. And I've just removed the picture insert that it came with, and have just a white backdrop there behind it. And to keep my paints from sliding down, you can see I've done a little bit of tape around the whole top there. And made a little ridge there with the tape to keep the colors right on up there. I don't normally have to do that. Usually a day or two before I paint, I lay out a little bit of the colors in each spot with the palette, and it's just sitting on a table normally, and then I let that dry, and then I can add color on top of those colors that have dried onto the glass, and that keeps everything stationary. But I selected this palette the day of, and so I needed to add a little tape to it to keep things from sliding around. So that's the end of the first sitting, and we're about to jump right into the next day here. Fresh palette, I've got some fresh paint up there, and a small brush, and I'm going to start zeroing in on some finer details. I'll do a little bit of shape correcting first, but really try to advance each little piece, moving from one section to the next. I'm still laying on thicker paint, so I'm not thinning anything down now, and I'm relying on some stiffer brushes here to paint with. I've got my little pointed ivory round, and that's helping me to get a little more drawing done. You know, it's less flimsy, so I can be a little harder on it. And just trying to mix some color variation inside this little plate. You can see I'm really settling down now to get slow observe, observe, do a little painting.
Why did you choose that plate to start with?
I think just because it was in the foreground and in the front, so it's kind of the first thing that you kind of see when you start scanning the painting, at least from the bottom up. And I've already developed the quality of the pot quite a bit, actually, with that first day, to the point where I think at this point I'm thinking to myself that there's not going to be too much work left on the actual the oven back there. And so, maybe some fine tuning and some details, but beyond that, I think the plates need to be resolved a little bit more for the sake of clarity, and it'll also help me set some of those really vibrant colors in there right away. But really, this is just a lot of patience here at this stage. Going really slow, correcting the drawing a little bit, modifying the colors a little bit by little bit. Almost like I'm just laying in tiny tiles of paint in here. I'm not letting the paint buildup get particularly heavy or impasto for this painting. It's not as much as though as how I painted the color master copy, where I really built up a little more paint and then smoothed it out with the knife. I don't think there'll be any smoothing or scraping here. Mostly because I want a lot of varied texture. Also, my painting surface that I started with was already very, very smooth, so scraping, doesn't work quite as well on a really smooth canvas as it does on one with a little bit more tooth, at least. The paints are already kind of sitting right on top, so if anything, I might soften out, but I won't do so much scraping. I've actually pulled out, if I recall correctly, a stool to sit on for this. And whenever I want to get into some really, really detailed areas and force myself to stay there without bouncing around too much, I pull out something to sit on, because I have a natural tendency to back up a lot. Sort of the training from my alla prima days, where you're more concerned with the overall impression. And so I have to work a little harder sometimes to force myself to slow down and stay in an area and just do a lot more observing, and contemplation of the various tiny little shifts that are happening. And so sitting down helps me do that. It gets me in the zone in one area instead of back and forth, thinking about the macro idea. There can be a danger, though, because sometimes if I do an alla prima and I'm sitting down, I get sucked into too much detail. And so typically for alla primas, I'll prefer to stand. And then for more detailed areas, after I've really captured that overall quality, like now, I'll sit down and really zero in on some detail. There is a pretty huge risk at this stage that as you start to lay in this detail, it may no longer fit into the overall hierarchy of things, especially if your block-in that you did originally wasn't particularly strong. Then you may end up just having to repaint over all this little fine-tuned work you did. But I feel like I have an overall set of relationships here that are correct enough that I can just jump into the detail and use the surrounding contextual color and value to ensure that I'm not going too light or too dark or too colorful. And I'm fairly certain that my perspectives are relatively correct here on this plate.